Dear Father Simon and the Collective, forgive me, for I have sinned very much. Many years ago I worked for a very large company, which we're not going to mention. I was lucky enough to be invited to their annual January shindig at a famously posh hotel just north of Stirling. That is as precise as we're going to get. After a convivial evening I retired to bed and rose just before 6 a.m. to go for my constitutional early morning run. As I entered the plush lobby, in my ridiculous lycra ensemble, a staff member, who was lighting one of the many open fires, wished me luck, but also warned me, and I quote, to be careful out there in the dark. Okay. Actually, should have said it in the voice of the verger from Dad's Army.
The Scottish verger.
Better be careful out there in the dark. Or maybe not.
That is just one of your voices.
It's actually just a normal voice. Obviously, in my still slightly inebriated state, I ignored his warning. As I stumbled outside into the cold, I soon realised that it was indeed dark, as you would expect before dawn in central Scotland in January. But as my eyes became accustomed to the lack of light, I soon noticed that it was a beautiful clear sky, with millions of stars evident, and a reasonably bright moon too. I began to run on this hotel's famous golf course, narrowed it down a bit, and found no difficulty keeping to the gravel paths which glowed in the moonlight. So about 20 minutes of huffing and puffing, I rounded a corner on the path just as a lone cloud moved in front of the moon, plunging my route into darkness. As I began to slow, trying not to trip in the dark, I immediately ran headlong into my victim. Bang!
Oh, no.
At this point, I should probably point out that I'm not the typical shape of a runner. In fact, my shape is probably more suited to the front row of a rugby scrum. In running terms, I'm approximately 1 Samo Farah tall, but weigh at least as much as, let's say, 2.5 Samo Farahs. So when I ran into my poor, unsuspecting victim, I hit them with sufficient force to elicit a harumph as I knocked the wind out of their sails. I also hit them with enough force to knock them clean off their feet. With my forward momentum suitably diminished, I tripped over their prone form and landed squarely on top of them, which led to another, slightly quieter harumph. As it turns out, this person was also quite a hefty unit, and I too was winded as I rolled them onto my back and slowly regained my composure. As soon as I recovered sufficiently, I apologised. "I'm sorry, mate," as we say around these parts. I just didn't see you there. Didn't see you in the dark." To my absolute horror, there was no answer. So again, I apologised. Again, no answer. And I did think that maybe I'd killed them. That would be a confession of a different kind,
Obviously,
wouldn't
that
it?
wouldn't get on.
I wonder what's happening. Here we are on page 2. Oh, there's no page 2. With rising dread, I sat up just as the aforementioned cloud moved past the moon, and the scene of the crime was bathed in the moonlight again. I turned to my victim and was momentarily relieved as they turned to me and stared straight up into my eyes. This relief was fleeting, though, because once my brain caught up, I then screamed with fright, leapt to my feet and ran off into the night at a pace which would have left Samo trailing easily. My victim simultaneously leapt up and went off in the other direction. When I got back to the hotel, the fire-lighting member of staff noticed my agitation, and after I explained why I was even more breathless than most fat businessmen who take on the undulating golf course after a late night, he confirmed that yes, there were stags out there.
Stags?
And that they were known to sleep on the paths. So when I said my victim simultaneously leapt up and went off in the opposite direction, what I meant to say was my victim got back on his 4 hooves and galloped off in the opposite direction, horns glinting in the moonlight. So therefore I seek forgiveness from the stag, who was minding his own business and did not expect to be mown down by a chartered accountant from Croydon in lycra whilst having a well-earned kip. Needless to say, I now run on main roads in large cities with street lighting. Well, you've got to be very careful, haven't you? You've got to keep your eyes open. You never know who you're going to run into, but you wouldn't expect necessarily to run into a stag and knock the stag off its feet. Sister Bobby, here she goes.
Richard, they told you to be careful. You thought, I'll be all right, it's nothing to be careful of. But you were running in the wrong woods, really, weren't you? All I'm going to say is I'm not going to forgive you. I'm not going to forgive you because you should have taken care. You should have been aware that may have been livestock. You were very lucky, actually, not to have ended up on one of the end of those horns. So count yourself lucky. Count yourself that he didn't come after you as well and that you could run fast enough. But you're not forgiven because the livestock take priority in my world. So you are not forgiven.
So the animal's kind of more important, is that what you're saying? Than the humans?
Well, yeah. Yeah, in this world, you're in their environment. Take care of them.
Okay, Nigel.
Now, having done quite a lot of cross-country running at various stages in my life, I loved running in the great outdoors. I didn't really like running in cities or on tarmac or anything, so if you could run across fells, so lucky enough to do that, great. But it doesn't sound to me like Richard is well-suited for this type of running. Certainly at 6 o'clock in the morning, that'll learn him for going out in his lycra in the middle of Scotland in January, when it'll be covered in snow, as it is now, I'm sure. And then for taking out a stag, a new meaning to a stag night, because it was still dark, and in this case, definitely, Ricardo, don't do it, you're not forgiven.
Okay, it's looking tough for you at the moment, Richard.
Well,
Matthew.
here's the thing. I go running early in the morning, and I tend to go in the dark.
You run into wildlife all the time.
Well, yeah, I don't want anyone else seeing my purple, sweaty face as I am desperately trying to do 10k in under, an hour and a half. Yeah. So I would absolutely love it, because when I get home, my wife always says, "How was the run?" I would absolutely love to be able to say, "Oh yeah, knocked over a stag. Anyway, I'm off for a shower." Yeah, knocked over a stag. I tell that story again.
Do they have many stags?
Not many stags
your neck of the
in
woods?
Arnos Grove's worth saying. More's the pity. So I'm going to say forgiven.
Because
Just because,
Okay.
I'd love to be able to do that.
Dear Simon and the League of Lenient Lovelies.
Yeah.
It's new and it's fresh. Allow me to take you back to the halcyon days of the early summer 1994, to a small convent school I attended in a sleepy Welsh valley town. School term was soon to end, and these were exciting times for a 9-year-old boy like me. You see, the 1994 Football World Cup was nearly upon us, and close behind it were 6 weeks of summer holidays. I was beside myself with anticipation of a summer spent gorging on football and then a little bit more football. To ready ourselves for the competition and ensure that we could confidently identify the entire lineup of teams like Cameroon and South Korea, myself and the other boys in our class were heavily involved in collecting football stickers for our World Cup sticker books. I imagine, Bobby, you were a big sticker collector.
Couldn't get enough of them.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
you have to absolutely. Did you go for the coins for the petrol station?
Yeah, of
Got that
course.
as well.
Back in the 70s.
We spent is that when it was?
Yes.
Okay. We spent every waking moment outside of lessons swapping stickers, searching for rare players and finding the much coveted shinies. Got that. Oh, I need that swap. Go on. Oh, come on. Stickers passed through grubby hands at manic speeds. Ignorant of the beautiful game and disapproving of the sticker collecting, however, was Mrs. Trumbull, our class teacher. She was an obstinate, hard-eyed sort who was determined to eke out every last moment of imparting knowledge to her charges before they left her class forever. In retrospect, she was probably a lovely lady who just wanted the best for her kids, but to a 9-year-old, her zero-tolerance attitude, as we discussed in the playground at the time, and a booming, room-shaking bark meant that she was absolutely terrifying. Mrs. Trumbull was particularly fond of inventors and pioneers such as Captain Scott and Alexander Graham Bell. One day in summer term, she spent the morning teaching us all about Sir Alexander Fleming and his world-changing discovery of penicillin. No one paid much attention, however, as we were all focused on the clock, waiting for the school bell to ring for lunch and further football sticker action. Got it. I need that one. Can I have your shiny? Please. Be your best friend. Give you some fudge. Sure enough, the bell finally went and was... I remember it.
Fudge. Right, whatever.
Yeah, you could swap.
finger of fudge.
You could swap some fudge.
Really?
For Ronaldo.
Did it have to be fudge?
Brilliant.
The old Ronaldo.
Yeah, fat Ronaldo.
Different times. I think he'd been eating the fudge. Sure enough, the bell finally went, and so excited was I about trying to find the famous striker Romario to complete my Brazil squad page. How much for... I think he's 2 fingers of fudge at least for Romario. I even waved food of any kind and absent-mindedly stuffed my mum's butter and ham sandwich, with the crusts cut off, into the recesses of my old-fashioned desk. You know, the ones where you lift the lid to store your belongings. A Romario sticker was obtained, and a week passed without a care, until one school morning we walked into class to find a very solemn and sour Mrs. Trumbull stood waiting for us, her face set and impassive. She said nothing while we took our seats, and then, to my dawning horror, Mrs. Trumbull reached over to her desk, grabbed something from it, and brandished it high in the air. Father Simon, I'm ashamed to say, It was my sandwich. Barely recognisable now, I knew it from the clear plastic bag it had been stored in, and it's fair to say the sandwich looked utterly revolting, wet and green and thickly covered in slimy, clumpy mould. I'd meant to throw it away, but the glorious game of football had made me forget all about it. I went cold and my heart sank. I was in trouble. You have to do this in a big Welsh accent, Father Simon.
Great.
However, Welsh John,
Yes.
I'm not going to.
Oh, shame.
Quiet, year 4, barked Mrs. Trumbull.
Yeah, go on.
Let's not deal in stereotypes.
Let's
Simon.
not.
Okay. It's come to my attention that our cleaner was tidying up the schoolroom ready for the end of term, looked in one student's desk, and she came across this. The oozy remnants swayed and rotated in her lofted hand. I breathed deeply and braced myself for the onslaught that was to come. She pointed across the room at me, and the entire class wheeled around in their seats to study my reddening face. However, I wasn't expecting what she said next. John here has obviously taken our lessons so close to heart that he's decided to experiment with making his own penicillin. If only you other boys stop fussing so much with those stupid football stickers, or whatever they're called, and applied yourselves more, you could be like him and learn something. Well done, John. I'm proud of you, young fella. She didn't say that. My jaw completely dropped. The class regarded me in something like awe, a junior boffin in their very midst, a true science pioneer. Sweating, my mouth popped open, closed like a goldfish. I was astounded. It was all the same to you, John. The experiment has been a success, but can I now dispose of the results, please? Asked Mrs. Trumbull. I nodded wordlessly, and she dropped the sandwich into the bin, and the class resumed its normal course. I didn't know how, but I had escaped unscathed, and this truth, Father Simon, has remained a secret for 23 years. And so I need forgiveness not from Mrs. Trumbull, who, despite her keen scientific mind, had led herself to the wrong conclusions in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. I also don't seek forgiveness from the school cleaner, who shouldn't have been poking her nose into my private affairs. Thanks very much indeed. Butt out! It's from Sir Alexander Fleming himself that I have to say sorry. He'd made the discovery of penicillin accidentally, which had merited being knighted in 1944 and given a Nobel Prize in 1945. But to the population of a small convent school in a sleepy Welsh Valley town, one 9-year-old boy genius had just done the very same. I also ask forgiveness from my mum, whose sandwiches were always very tasty. Simon and the League, I throw myself down before your judgment, but please bear in mind I always finish my sandwiches now. I even eat the crusts. Says Welsh John. What was that cleaner do? I'll just have a little look. Oh, look, smelly sandwich. Sister Bobby.
Well, that's the thing, the cleaner probably smelt it. I always remember being told off, don't grow penicillin in your hot milk cups. Bring your cups down, Bobby, otherwise you're in trouble. The thing is, Mrs. Trumbull
That's a good
knew.
upbringing, that is.
That is, Mrs. Trumbull knew. I think she just turned a really negative situation where she could tell him off into something positive. She's fab. I love her. I wish I had her as a teacher. Completely forgiven. Very unsounding Welsh John. Yes. Welsh John, you're forgiven.
Okay, all right, Brother Matthew.
Yes, 94 World Cup, from what I remember, was a pretty dull World Cup. No England, and, the final went to penalties. It was pretty awful. So,
the one in America?
Yes, it was, yes. Diana Ross missed an open goal. What I would say is, my instinct is that Mrs. Trumbull actually was trying to hammer home what penicillin was to a bunch of very bored students. And she decided, the way I'm going to do this is I am going to find this, and when this sandwich lands on her lap, she thinks, I'm going to make use of this, and these kids are going to understand what penicillin really is when I produce this sandwich. So I think she knew exactly what she was doing, and for that reason I'm going to forgive.
A 70s teacher would have thrown it, would have picked up the sandwich and thrown it at Welsh John.
Different times.
Take this home, boy.
Yeah.
But yes, we moved on.
Fortunately we have, haven't we?
Well, forgive me, Father Simon, for I have sinned. We go back to 1992, when I was a probationary teacher at a school in North Yorkshire. My colleagues were all very long-standing, aka old, and I was quite a novelty, being the youngest member of staff at the ripe old age of 27. Having got into teaching a few years later than most, I had at least acquired some understanding of the real world, and I prided myself on my ability to organise things learnt during a previous job in a DIY store. One particular teacher, however, Miss Parker, was the queen of organisation. I watched in awe as she effortlessly organised just about everything, from kids making her cups of tea during her lesson, different times, to assemblies, school trips, parent meetings, school activities and everything else that a good school offers. Miss Parker was the head of the house, and she ruled with a metaphorical rod of iron. The kids respected her, and I did too. It was getting near to the end of the year, and Miss Parker had a great idea to raise the kids' spirits. She would organise a house trip to the Granada studio tour in Manchester. As the day came closer, she asked whether I would be willing to be in charge of one of the coaches, as it was a big trip with over 80 students likely to be going. Suitably flattered, I accepted willingly, deciding that I would use the opportunity to earn some brownie points. On the day of the trip, however, things got off to a bad start when I saw the list of students. Miss Parker seemed to have given herself all the good kids on her bus, and I had the naughty boys and the girls who talked about nothing but neighbours on my bus. On her bus, meanwhile, Miss Parker had already taken the register and was ready for the off, whilst my rabble were bouncing around like a box of frogs. Eventually, after what seemed like an age, I ascertained that all were present and correct. Indeed, even the kid known as Nuclear Arthur had turned up for a day out. I like the sound of Nuclear Arthur, although you might not want him on your coach. I looked across to the irritated Miss Parker in the bus next to me and put my thumb up to show that we're all present and correct. She pointed to her watch and tapped it, then shrugged. Clearly her faith in me effectively to organise my bus had been misplaced, and her strict timetable was now running 10 minutes late. It was on the hour-and-a-half journey that I decided to tackle the source of her disappointment head-on. I devised in my mind a system whereby I would be able to account for all my students in a matter of seconds, based on the buddy system that I'd seen being used at an American summer camp I'd worked on a couple of years previously. Having got my bus to be quiet enough to hear me, I explained my plan to the kids. My plain honesty seemed to win them over, and the conversation went something like this. Look, guys, I need your help. Miss Parker thinks we're a bunch of losers, and I want to prove her wrong by beating her at her own game. Taking the register earlier was a nightmare, as she managed to do hers in 2 minutes. Ours took about an hour. I reckon we can do the register in less than 30 seconds if you're going to help. I went on to describe that they were now sitting next to the person who would be their buddy for the day. I explained that whenever I needed to take the register, I simply waited for them to find their partner. They waved their hands out and call out their pair's number at the right moment. I pointed to Eric and Ben. You are buddies number 1. Stacey and Karen, buddies number 2. James and Sam, your buddies number 3, and so on. When I shout, register! You and your buddy need to hold up your hands, shout out your number as loud as you can. As soon as you finish, the next pair to do the same. We continue all the way through to pair number 23. They didn't seem keen at first, but as we practiced, it turned into a game. And at the given moment, a pair of hands would fly up and the children would shout out their number at ridiculous volume. The peer pressure was so great that even the slothful children, who had unfortunately sat next to someone they didn't like, were forced to join in. And with practice, the time took to account for all the children dropped from 2 minutes to less than 25 seconds.
Wow.
We arrived at Granada studio tours, and I was asked by a still frosty Miss Parker if I could account for all my students. I shouted, register! And as if by magic, my kids suddenly went into a series of apparent convulsions, throwing their hands in the air and shouting their pair's number at the same time. Things were going swimmingly until we got to pair number 17, when I heard, I can't find Nuclear Arthur, sir. Initially annoyed, Nuclear Arthur was soon located by the chewing gum machine, and the system seemed to have been proved as being fit for purpose. Miss Parker looked on approvingly, and we went in. We had a great day on the tour. About 3 p.m, our students got on the buses ready to head back north again. When I called, register, those on my bus were accounted for in 10 seconds flat. And I went over to Miss Parker's bus to tell her that we were all present and correct. I smiled inwardly as her face showed mild irritation. After all, she was still near the beginning of her register. What a loser. I returned to my bus, just a little smug. We settled into the journey home, and soon the excessive heating and the rocking motion of the bus had a soporific effect on us all, and I felt myself nodding off. Half an hour later, I felt someone tapping me on the shoulder, and it was Katie, half of the number 7s. Sir, there's something wrong at the back of the bus. I think you need to come and see. With dread in my heart and anticipating the acrid stench of regurgitated chicken nuggets, I was pleasantly surprised to be pointed towards a child who looked relatively healthy. It was only as I drew closer that I started to have misgivings. Why was she sitting alone? Where was her buddy? Now, I've always been bad at names, but I actually know my students very well. I can tell you what they're like, what their work is like, whether they're lazy, whether or not they do their homework. So it was nothing new that I didn't know this girl's name, but worryingly, I didn't know anything about her. I had no idea about her work, whether she was lazy, did any homework. And this is because, Father Simon, I'd never seen her before in my life. A cold chill came upon me. Certainly she was wearing the same plain black and white uniform as our school, but she wasn't one of ours. And upon investigation, it turned out she belonged to a school about an hour and a half south of Manchester, and we were heading north. I reluctantly called Miss Parker in the bus ahead of us to break the news to her that in the coach behind was an abducted child. Miss Parker managed to contact Granada Studios, put an end to their search for a missing child. We turned round and met the bus from her school at a petrol station somewhere in the outskirts of Manchester. We did a swap. Their teachers were so relieved to get the child back that they were really, really nice to me, considering. Father Simon, and especially Sister Bobby, says Neil, I don't seek forgiveness from the child, who knew full well that she was on the wrong bus. Neither do I seek forgiveness from her teachers. They should have had a buddy system to ensure they kept tabs on all their children. I do seek forgiveness, however, from all the staff at Granada Studio Tours, who no doubt had to run around looking for a missing child. It should be noted that they stopped the Granada Studio Tours a few years later. Perhaps it was too much stress, constantly having children going missing due to inept teachers. According to Neil, that is. One of the many things I like about that is no stage is Nuclear Arthur accounted for. No, we don't know why he's called Nuclear Arthur. He just is Nuclear Arthur.
Yeah.
Neil, thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be assorted horror stories based on school trips from teachers and pupils. Sister Bobby, what do you say?
Oh, I love that story. That's great, because the kids were absolutely spot on and brilliant, weren't they? So really good opportunity for them, because they did, didn't they? They joined in, they did it. Thing is, Neil, I'm not going to forgive you. The reason why is your buddy system was brilliant. But there was an error in your system. There was an anomaly, wasn't it? Because it didn't account for added
The old-fashioned way,
bodies.
if you'd actually add, if you just count it, if you did a head count, you'd have had one extra.
So Neil, you're not forgiven because your system was good but not foolproof.
I like the buddy system, though. What
Yes,
do you
I think it works perfectly well, and I think we've all got in our heads the reason why Nuclear Arthur was given that name. Don't need to go into it in detail now. This reminds me of when I went on a school trip to Chester Zoo, and I was on the coach, and basically the coach was stopping at, it appeared to me, everyone's house and dropping them off. So I decided I would stay on the coach until it stopped at my house. What in fact happened is that they did all the other stops, and then the driver drove me to Blackpool, which I obviously hadn't been on my plan. I was on the back seat and ended up on a hen do. But obviously I didn't go on the hen do. But it's easily done. Easily done. That's my point. Yes, definitely forgiven, because the system was working perfectly well until she decided to gate crash.
Father Simon and the Confessing Mutual. As a reformed, is a winning opening sentence. As a reformed Scottish Presbyterian church minister,
Here we go.
I have to admit a bit of unease at asking for forgiveness from anyone but our good Lord. But hey, if it gets me on the radio, and but more importantly, a bit of peace, I'll give it a try. This is the Reverend Gary here, Scottish Presbyterian church minister, asking us for forgiveness. My tale goes back long before ordination to when I was a teenager in the 80s. I was working hard for my Bronze Duke of Edinburgh award in the Scouts in Ayrshire. Part of the award was demonstrating a skill of some sort or other, and I was wondering what to do. Then I remembered that a few years before I had, despite showing absolutely no musical talent at all, had somehow managed to convince my mother that piano lessons would be a good idea. Being a good mum, she consulted friends, and a piano tutor was sourced and a trial lesson booked. I do confess to being a little shy in those days, so my mother came along with me to the first lesson, which took place in the piano teacher's house. It was there that I got my first experience of Mrs. Van Straten. She was an elderly lady, but with a strangely fine head of black hair. When we first arrived, she was finishing off the previous lesson. As some unfortunate teenager finished her lesson, Mrs. Van Straten, who I'd come to learn was a rather strict, foreboding and sometimes fierce tutor in a kind of Miss Jean Brodie style, was playing to the gallery, basically me and my mum. As she barked instructions to this girl, she was also delighting in asking us loads of questions. More of an interrogation, really. Question number 3 on her list was, "What kind of piano do you have?" I immediately looked at my feet and my mother mumbled sheepishly, "Well, we don't actually have a piano." I thought Mrs. Van Straten was going to explode, but my mother eventually calmed her down, explaining that we would get one if I enjoyed the lessons, and that in the meantime we had an arrangement with our church that I could practice on their piano. So there you go. It's a perfect, really, really perfect answer for Mrs. Van Straten there. Despite this poor start, the rest of the lesson went well, and it was agreed that I would indeed start weekly tuition. And so began several years of terrifying and in many ways fruitless lessons as Mrs. Van Straten tried to turn a talentless musician like me into some sort of piano prodigy. I think it dawned on her pretty quickly that this lump of coal was never going to be a diamond, as I often murdered the various pieces that she gave me. However, the upside for me was that several years later, when I was looking for a skill to do for my Duke of Edinburgh award, I was able to faithfully log my lessons, which were then helping me towards meeting all the requirements for the Bronze Award. Many months later, I was beside myself with excitement when I was told that I had met all the requirements for the Bronze DOE and that I was to be presented with the badge and certificate during one of our scout meetings on a Friday night. I was also told that I could invite some guests who had helped me in my achievement. Well, obviously my long-suffering parents, who'd put up with my intolerable practicing, would have to be invited. And as I thought who else might swell with pride as I collected my award, in a moment of graciousness, I thought about Mrs. Van Straten. So the invites were sent, and I was delighted when she told me at the next lesson that she would love to attend and that she also accepted the offer of a lift from my parents. The day arrived, and it was a cold and very wet, dark evening when I turned up at our scout hut in my perfectly ironed uniform. When the allotted time came for the guests to file from the pre-award drinks upstairs, I anxiously scanned the room to see where my parents and Mrs. Van Straten would be sitting. As I looked around, I could only see my mother sitting there, and as I caught her eye, she proceeded to shake her head in a very serious manner. In italics, that, by the way.
Wow.
Is that how you shake your head?
Because I don't know how badly this is going to go wrong. It's not apparent yet, but
It's not.
I believe
It's one
it's
of those
going to
we think,
be.
I've got no idea.
Poor old Gary.
Not knowing what she meant, I took my place in the line of other scouts awaiting their awards. After the ceremony, I rushed over to see my mum, who had then been joined by my rather flustered father, and I asked where Mrs. Van Straten was. This is the point, Father Simon, where I need to tell you that our scout hut used to be at the top of a small hill, at the end of a rather dark street. The hall had no car park, and spaces directly outside the hall were at a premium. A pavement ran up the street to the hall, but stopped there, and was replaced by a grass verge that ran up the rest of the hill. You've got a map there. As I excitedly waited for the invited guests to arrive, it transpired that my father had arrived and tried to park his car as close to the hall as possible to save Mrs. Van Straten walking too far in the now torrential rain. He gallantly turned the car and parked her next to the grass verge on the same side as the hall. What he didn't notice was the rather large hole that an electricity company had dug and subsequently failed to illuminate or fence off. So as his car came to a stop, Mrs. Van Straten opened the door, stepped out, and like she's in a cartoon, fell directly into a large 6-foot-deep, pitch-dark, muddy hole. It took quite a few minutes for my father in the dark to work out where she'd gone.
Dear.
Mrs. Van Straten. Took many more minutes for him to retrieve the rather bewildered, muddy and extremely soggy piano teacher from said hole. Being rather unimpressed with the whole situation, as it were, she switched into Miss Jean Brodie mode and demanded to be taken home immediately, hence her absence from the award ceremony. Father Simon, I seek forgiveness not for myself and not from Mrs. Van Straten, as she was not the most pleasant of people, but rather I seek absolution for my poor father, who not only had to retrieve a rather soggy Mrs. Van Straten from the bottom of a 6-foot muddy hole, but who, after he finally managed to bundle her back into the car, noticed that she was now bald, and he had to go back into the hole, which was, as I mentioned, dark and rather muddy.
Get the ferret. Yeah.
To get the black wig. He's never told me what Mrs. Van Straten said to him on the car journey back, but he still twitches whenever her name is mentioned, and amazingly the subject was never brought up again at any future lessons. But Gary, think of all the sermons that you can get out of that as you preach there for the Scottish Presbyterian churches. So there you go. It was one of those stories where I've got to a page and a half and still you would have had no idea where that was heading, and indeed neither did Mrs. Van Straten know exactly where she was heading, because the answer was down a 6-foot hole. What do you say there, Bobby?
Ah, poor lady. I feel really sorry for her. You know, she's taken out on a night out, and it's actually good of her to attend one of her pupils, not one of her star pupils. I mean, I wasn't sure whether he was going to do a kind of a bit of a play for her, and she would have been embarrassed. I thought it was going in a completely different direction. Playing the piano.
Oh, right.
You're all looking at me strangely.
What are you talking about?
Oh, no, is he? You know, he was.
Yes.
I
He was
understand,
part
to
of the
play.
music.
He went-
It was completely honest.
He went to
Anyway.
stroke her hair passionately and oops.
Anyway, no. Anyway,
No.
I think this is no one's fault. I think it's
Yes.
an accident. I think it's unfortunate. I don't think I look outside the car if I get out of a passenger's door and look down. It's unfortunate. It's a series of unfortunate accidents, and it seems to me that, Gary, that your dad kept it a secret about her not having her own hair. Well, maybe not having much hair. You're forgiven.
A series of unfortunate events. Novice, what do you say?
So, on a point of clarification, is he a Reformed Scottish Presbyterian, as he no longer is, or was it the Scottish Reformed Church?
I think it's the church that's reformed. I don't think he's. I don't
He's still
think he
at it.
means he's seen the error of his ways.
No, I wasn't sure. I wasn't decided to become agnostic or something.
I don't
Anyway,
think the theology matters too much.
right. Now, I was
We
all
could do
right
that on
with
the
this
show
until-
tomorrow, couldn't we? The divisions in the church, the
Yes.
Protestant church in Scotland.
Oh, no, I've turned my back
No,
on
sorry,
them.
you don't need to comment. Go on.
When he said that she wasn't the most pleasant of people, so I don't know why Gary actually even asked her. I actually had a similar to a Mrs. Van Straten in my life, Nigel Horsfall. I've had to listen for years to me plinketing the ivories, and it's not much fun listening to people who obviously got very little talent, and Gary hadn't got that in that department. He did ask her, that was nice. The grass verger on this occasion, Gary, I'm forgiving you.
If you're forgiving him,
Yes,
what do you
yes,
say
I'm
there,
giving
brother?
an ing.
I think this story basically depends on how you feel towards Mrs. Van Straten. And there will be lots who have sympathy with her. I somewhat took against her quite a bit for no reason other than probably the name. I don't know why. But and so really she should have been looking where she's going. You've got to look where you're going. We all know that's Room 101. Look where you're going. So is it all her fault? Maybe not. But probably, yes, it is. So let's say definitely forgiven.
Father Simon and the Merciful Menagerie. It's October 1984. I was in the Royal Navy and had just returned from a long and arduous patrol aboard one of the UK's finest submarines. Watchkeeping at sea for such a length of time means one tends to forget the realities of life, such as what day or month it is, or even whether it would be light or dark. I slept, ate, worked and slept some more. Around the end of the patrol, I'd begun to fester with a nasty cough and general feelings of unwellness, but being a roughy-tufty kind of guy, I just got on with it. Shoot forward a month, into mid-November, I'd returned to Plymouth to try and sort out the second floor of what's called our married quarters. It's fair to say the married quarters were quite a dump and needed a fair bit of doing to them, especially as my now wife had moved in to join me in Plymouth. Unfortunately, I was still hacking and throwing phlegm every... Oh, by the way, I was supposed to say... Sorry. Oh, sorry. Just noticed.
Yeah.
You might just want to give a little warning for people...
Maybe before we got to the hacking. Yeah.
Virus alert. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so if you're eating... Sorry. It's only a PG.
Okay.
That's not the PG bit, but I'm just saying.
Oh, my goodness.
But I was still acting roughy-tufty, so I threw off my wife's concerns and I just got on with the job. That's because that's what I do. Because I'm a roughy-tufty kind of guy. However, as I attempted to knock the flat into some sort of shape, I noticed there was a particularly stubborn patch of mould fungus on the bathroom tiles. Nothing I had in the house would shift it, so I had to wander down to the shipyard stores and purloin some substance the stores folk assured me would, and I quote, take lead off a roof. See, I think this kind of thing you might get in a shipyard store, but you wouldn't get from your local DIY.
So it's got to be good.
As I walked back to the flat, I was struck with a mischievous thought, and the most brilliant idea was hatched. Oh, so I thought. So brilliant, it was like a brilliant fox with a degree in brilliantness from the University of Brilliant Town. Well, at least I thought it was, anyway. We shall see. As I used my newly acquired chemical to remove the fungus-encrusted tiles from the bathroom walls, I decided to ramp up my coughing and wheezing somewhat. My wife, who was downstairs at her new friend's flat, couldn't help but hear my exaggerated wheezing and came up the stairs to check on her loved one. It was here that I put my plan into action, and I pretended to faint. I lay on the bathroom floor because it would make her think that I'd passed out. What japes in the Navy, huh?
What could possibly go wrong?
Although she'd initially been worried, I reasoned, I knew that once my ruse was up, my wife and I would laugh merrily whilst quaffing a fine beverage, or something like that. And all went very well until she opened the bathroom door, and the tile-removing chemicals hit her like a freight train. So quickly did my wife turn her head away from the chemical weapon that unfortunately she slammed her nose bang into the door frame. As the door frame had probably been there since the Boer War, it didn't move one bit. Though unfortunately, my wife's nose did, to her right cheek.
Oh!
This obviously caused her nose to start bleeding, and whilst trying to stem the flow, she ended up with blood over her hands, over her face, and over... That's the PG bit, right?
Okay.
Over her hands and clothes and everywhere, basically. As my injured wife staggered down the hallway, clutching her bust nose, her new best friend, who'd been sitting downstairs, as I mentioned, arrived to help, took one look at my wife and fainted. How was I to know the friend suffered from haemophobia, which is the extreme fear of blood?
Yeah.
At this point, I should probably also point out that the woman's husband had also been sitting with them in the flat downstairs, and after hearing the commotion was on his way up. What on earth was I to do? Well, me being the roughy-tufty kind of guy that I was, I stayed put on the bathroom floor, pretending to be unconscious. The scene must have been straight out of a horror film. His wife, face down on the floor, not moving, my wife wandering around like a zombie, splattered in her own blood, and me half in, half out the bathroom, seemingly unconscious. Well, after screaming for a bit, he phoned for an ambulance, and by the time it arrived, my wife's friend had regained some consciousness and was complaining of a sore wrist. Meanwhile, my wife had grabbed a towel and was sat in the hall with her head buried in it. As for me, I continued my unconscious act, only slowly starting to come round a little bit as the paramedics arrived. As I was the only person still not fully conscious, I became the ambulance folks' priority, and I was duly strapped into a chair, hoisted down 2 flights of stairs, and whisked off to hospital. Still covered in blood, my wife had to drive herself.
Oh, my goodness.
4 miles to the hospital, along with her maybe not now best friend, who was crying and sobbing quite loudly. I really am truly apologetic about my antics and feel a great weight has been lifted as I write these words after telling my tale. I can't apologise more to my wife for her broken nose, nor the unpleasant minor surgery to correct the bends that meant it favoured her right cheek. I'm less sorry for her new best friend and husband as they shipped out a few weeks later to Hong Kong, never to be seen again. Well, by us, anyway. I mean, it was fine.
Yes.
Oops. But it turns out my own trip to hospital wasn't wasted. The aforementioned cough and splutters turned out to be pneumonia, which we've already mentioned once, and the doctors also found some very bizarre burning to the inside of my lungs, which to this day they could not explain. I spent the next 3 weeks in hospital with my very attentive and caring wife at my bedside, and to show how much I cared, I never once mentioned the 2 large rolls of dressing stuffed up her nose with a sling contraption holding it all in place. However, here's the thing. After 35 years... it's probably about time she knew what actually happened. So this is another confession where this incident is, of course, very well known within Jack's nautical circles. However, the whole thing was a fabrication. And he never passed out because of the fumes. He wasn't even passed out at all. He was just pretending. Anyway, I like the sound of the stores that he bought his special chemicals in. What do you say to that, Sister Bobby?
Oh, I couldn't see the jape in this. Look, I love hijinks, but I couldn't see what he was trying to get at. I don't know what he was trying to intend.
Trying to scare his
well,
new wife.
Yeah, but for what effect? Was it because that's it, is you don't know the consequences, and you're not 5. When you're 5, it's funny, but not when you're 25. And the other thing is, this is why, Jack, I can't forgive you. I can't forgive you because you injured 2 other people. You wasted an ambulance time, even though you did have pneumonia. That also I'm not going to forgive you for, because that's typical of you not going to the doctors in the first place. Pneumonia is really, really dangerous, and it could have been worse. So you're not forgiven on 4 counts.
3 or 4 counts.
So there you go.
I'd say we toned down the injuries just a little bit.
Okay.
Oh, really?
Just for tea time listening.
Oh,
Novice Nigel.
Jack, you silly Billy. That's all I can say. But it was the chemicals what did it. Did he say? But he was in hospital for 3 weeks.
He was, because they found that he had pneumonia and some burning to his lungs, which may well have been caused by the thing he got from the stores. You never know.
Well, a bit of both. Scarring of the lungs and all the things that go with it. And been some horrendous stuff like that going around recently. But plasma alert, we got over that. Skiving in hospital for 3 weeks, but he is a submariner, and I have to say, for a man who's occasionally suffered from claustrophobia, certainly more potholing, I'll never do that again.
So you're not a roughy. You're not a roughy-tufty kind of guy.
Well, I thought I was. I didn't say anything, but Chris Brown-Humes, he got stuck in front of me, and we all had to wait while he came out backwards.
It's a showbiz anecdote, everybody.
It wasn't good. So, Jack, you roughy tufty submariner, 40 years on, you're forgiven.
Brother Matthew.
Look how we got onto potholing there.
Yes.
I didn't see that one coming at all. I'm probably going to forgive here because, I mean, which of us can honestly say we've not done a joke that's probably gone the wrong way, and then you've got to carry on with the joke because otherwise it loses the whole potency of the joke in the first place. And, I mean, you are dicing with danger when you do those coughing fits, but as it turned out, it was absolutely the right thing to do because he ended up in hospital. Best place for him with the pneumonia. Yeah. So I'm going to forgive.
This is the BBC.
Hello and welcome. It's another Confessions podcast from your friends at Radio 2. Oh, I've got some space here, have I? This is ID Wow Ramp. I could have spoken over this bit, but I didn't rehearse it.
88 to 91 FM.
Got there in the end.
BBC Radio 2.
So, this week's Concise Collection features Landing of Confusion, Smooth Operator, as a painful one that is, Flavour of the Old School, and Run Rabbit Run. Here they all come. Father Simon and the Underlings.
What?
Sorry, I'm just saying.
This is going to go well.
This is from
It's all
Richard.
right.
Richard.
Well, my guess is that you're not.
Not forgiven. Already writing it down. Yeah.
Actually,
It's
I think you're probably right. After many years of working within the industry, Father Simon, I feel it's time to confess something from my cabin crew days that has sat heavily on my guilty heart for a long time. As I'm sure you know, us cabin crew are on aeroplanes for a lot more than simply serving drinks and snacks. We're highly trained in many aspects of safety and can put out fires, break up fights, save your life, deliver babies, and of course, should the worst happen, get you evacuated from an aircraft that finds itself in an emergency situation. The training is intense and difficult. Many people fail. But those that make it through the grueling 7-week course eventually make it onto an aircraft to do their first ever flight with real-life, full fare paying, genuine passengers. However, the other thing to know is that when one joins an airline, there is an unwritten rule that the person should be initiated in a way that fully immerses them into the working world of trudging about on planes 6 days a week. One such day in 2006, I was the purser when we were taking an aircraft out to Rome, and we had a newbie on the crew, a 19-year-old girl, let's call her Alice, fresh-faced and smiley and brimming with enthusiasm. Perhaps she had a little bit too much enthusiasm. Some might say she was a little overconfident in her role. Shiny and new out of training, Alice thought she knew it all. No problem was too much for her to deal with, and she had an answer for every passenger and crew member on the aircraft. She knew the exact route, she knew the exact speed of the aircraft, she was far too aware of every minutiae of the service we were to deliver to our passengers. She was, to put it bluntly, really rather irritating. Now, the usual first aid pranks were pretty standard. We'd tell newbies that we were having a customs inspection on landing, so it was essential they should count every sugar sachet on board. We'd replace the safety demonstration life jacket with a real one, which would blow up instantly when they pulled the red toggle during the pre-flight briefing. We'd delicately balance a cup of water above their seat so that it would fall on them as the aircraft landed. I could go on, but they're all harmless fun. I knew, however, I'd have to get Alice with something special, and I concocted a plan with Simon, the captain, who was always up for a prank, much like Matt always is.
Oh,
He's
yes.
full of...
Already putting my black hat on for this one. Yeah, go on.
Now, normally on a short-haul flight, the pilots give us heads up over the PA when we have 10 minutes to landing, so we can start to prepare the aircraft. However, on this occasion, Captain Simon gave us 10 minutes to landing, and he gave the crew 15 minutes to landing. Now, this was phase 1 of his evil scheme, and all the other crew knew exactly what was happening. Everyone except Alice. So we prepared the aircraft for landing as normal and then took our positions in the jump seats ready to land. However, we didn't land, we continued to fly. Alice looked confused in her seat, glanced at her watch, expecting to hear the aircraft gear lower, which would mean we had about 90 seconds to land. No such noise came. Playing my part, I popped into the flight deck, where all was well and normal, except the sly and deceitful smile on mine and Simon's face. Returning back into the passenger cabin, I walked hurriedly down to Alice's seat, and with a worried expression on my face, I explained to her that there was a problem with the landing gear. I told Alice that as the most junior member of the crew, we would need her to try and help dislodge it.
What?
She was to head to the middle of the aircraft, just behind the wings, in the middle of the aisle, and jump up and down in the middle of the cabin as hard as she could to try and dislodge the stuck landing gear. Now, obviously, in these situations, we didn't want to alarm the passengers, so if any one of them were to ask what she was doing, I told Alice to say, "These are my judo exercises that I like to do every day. You should try them once we've got back into the landing craft."
Once you're on ground,
That's the
perhaps.
one.
Yeah.
Alice looked horrified. The perfectly made-up face drained of colour, and her overly smarmy demeanour vanished instantly. But clearly keen to save the day, she did as she was asked. She walked to the middle of the passenger cabin and, without saying a word, jumped up and down as forcibly as she could, stamping, stamping, stamping. Several passengers turned to see what was going on. Her hair fell loose from her perfectly coiffured donut. Sweat began to form on her foundation-stained brow. A good 30 seconds passed of Alice jumping up and down in the middle of the aisle, and still the gear hadn't dislodged. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew and I were hiding behind a curtain. The galley, that's where we were, crying with laughter and doubled over. A peek round the curtain a few seconds later showed Alice to be on her hands and knees, banging the airplane floor with her hands, screaming, "Come on! Come on!" This was far too much for us to bear. We collapsed into uncontrollable laughter. Thankfully, at that moment, Simon did lower the landing gear, and Alice, convinced she'd performed a truly heroic deed that had brought us all back from the brink of certain doom, began some mild hysterics, high-fiving passengers as she shakily returned to her seat. Her face was the epitome of relief and jubilation. Of course, the aircraft was fine. Our passengers disembarked. Alice took a moment to compose herself. So I seek forgiveness not from Alice, who still to this day has no idea that the
Really?
whole thing was a massive prank. Nor do I seek forgiveness from the passengers, some of whom may have thought that the aircraft was staffed by a crew with a nervous disposition. I seek forgiveness today from the engineers back at our base, who, when we landed back home that evening, had to replace the carpet in the aisle where Alice had made so many rips and tears from her incessant jumping and pounding. Now, I reckon I'm fairly attuned to the way these things are going to go.
Yeah.
So, and I already know that Matt doesn't like it because of just because he was referred to as an underling, which never goes down very well. Plus, I take a look at Bobby and I'm going, let me just take a look at Bobby now. Oh, Face of Thunder
Yes.
is what I'm looking at. Because I actually think Richard was slightly put out by how clever and smart Alice was and couldn't cope. Anyway, let's check in with Sister Bobby from the Priory.
Yeah, well, the thing is, work hijinks are a common thread through the confessions, and we love them generally. The thing is, you're on a plane, and that puts hijinks in a completely different situation, because you're in a plane, you're in a tin can in the air. So I'm really worried about hijinks when you're in a tin can in the air, regardless of the physics. The other thing I'm a little bit concerned about is, doesn't Alice know how her plane is put together? Doesn't she know that she's banging up and down on the wrong floor? That actually the floor of the cabin is not the floor of where the landing gear is. It's going to have a little impact. I'm more worried about why Alice is in charge of safety of all of us, actually. That concerns me. Richard, you are unforgiven. You don't mess around in planes.
Go on then, Matt.
Well, yes, I mean, I'm going to go along with Bobby on this. Number one, I think for this gag to work, the passengers needed to be in on it, because you're on this plane, and if I was on a plane and somebody started jumping up and down in the middle, I'd be a little perturbed. So, in order for it to be funny, everyone else needs to be in on it as well as, and not her. And also, landing gear, obviously, is at the front of the plane, and at where else? It's on the wings, isn't it? It is on my toy one. Where else are the... Anyway, the wheels are not in the middle of the plane.